All right, everyone. Uh, Welcome back. This is the continuation of the lecture on Marx. What I want to talk about is I want to develop this idea of the ownership of the means of production, and how it shows itself for Marx, especially well in two ways. So, first of all, his dates are 1818 to 1883. I'll never ask them, but there they are. Uh, Ownership of the means of production. So there's two ways to understand this. There's more than that, but we're going to understand it generally in two ways. And that's as regards this next slide, which is there's two Marxes. There's like the older Marx, it's the scientific Marx, and the younger Marx, which is, he's a humanist. This usually how he's broken down into these two categories. The older Marx, the scientific Marx, um, he understands the insights that he has in terms of science with scientific Marx. But what this means is this: during the day, physics was the science par excellence. It could tell you where the moon's going to be, and then you can go and look a year from now, and sure enough, it's right where they said it was going to be. If you were a science, you had to have that kind of predictability, and Marx is trying to make economics, sociology, this kind of science. So like a human science based on the ownership of the means of production. Okay, and so this ends up making this principle something maybe overwrought or reified too much. I mean, it's a very important principle, and we'll see that it is. But Marx seems to make everything about my life reduced to this one principle, and it may be true. But the scientific Marx also reduces all of human history to this scientific principle. So we can say it this way: Marx asks the question this way or addresses the question this way. So excuse the gender specificity. Is it men who make history or history who makes men? If it's men who make history, then it's the people that are the actors and cause historical change. So it's the freedom that makes history. Now, if it's history that makes men, then there's something about this power of history that us, people, are all like sort of moments in this wave. So, what are we doing? We're doing what the historical moment calls for us to do. And not so much we're doing what we want, and that causes the historical moment. Okay? So, the scientific Marx takes this ownership of the means of production and makes it like everything. Freud has done something like this too when he makes this sexual desire, especially sexual desire for my mother and wanting to kill my father, this thing, the principle that motivates everything. Everything. I mean, so that, both Marx and Freud and others, and Skinner tries to do this, Pavlov tries to do this in the human sciences, trying to reduce human behavior to a strict science like physics. They fail. They try really hard. But that they fail there doesn't mean that their insights are worthless because they didn't make this universal principle. So, Marx isn't alone there, but the scientific Marx is Marx, and I want to explore him. We're going to explore the ownership of the means of production and on a less historical, grandiose scale, and we're going to look at it in terms of the individual and his or her relations with other people in work. That's the estranged labor element. So estranged labor will be the ownership of the means of production as the means by which I cannot be the kind of thing that I am. Okay? So we'll get to that in a second. Now I want to look at this. So for Marx, the ownership of the means of production in the scientific sense has an inaugural moment in history. And that inaugural moment in history also sets up a trajectory for history that will culminate in, well, today, or Marx's today, and will call for a revolution and all this other stuff. So there is something about the nature of history that is all connected because of the ownership of the means of production. And so I want to just trace that out really quickly, because this is a famous and important part of Marx. This is not all of Marx, and one can put more emphasis on this than perhaps even Marx did. So let's just take a look at it. So that inaugural moment of the ownership of the means of production is, well, when one person directly owns another person as the productive thing. So master-slave. Okay, so that moment in history where there was the direct ownership of the person as master-slave set up all of history to become, well, communist in Marx's ideas, right? So this is what he's describing and predicting. Now, master-slave is there's a face-to-face relationship. So in some sense, it's like this, right? But in another sense, it's two different lives, two different kinds of freedom. One is a freedom like that is its own. Another is a freedom that is for the other, right? So though there is a face-to-face thing, and though there is almost the same look, maybe they're both humans. There is a radical difference in lives, and the principle of the ownership of the means of production. We'll talk about what it also means as regards the worker individually and the owner individually later on with the estranged labor thing. So right now we're just looking at the movement through history. And so master-slave for Marx sets up this relationship, the conditions of the owner, the material conditions of ownership of the means of production, Marx says, call for the next emergence of owner-worker, right? So master-slave will sort of dissolve or into or grow into or transform into and with a strict necessity. The next moment in the development of history is plebeian patrician. This is Roman. Master-slave is Greek. Plebeian patrician is Roman. And again, with this sort of economic necessity of like a scientific law, patrician plebeian will resolve into, develop into, change into lord serf. This is medieval Europe. And again, like a scientific principle, the ownership of the means of production of lord serf will dissolve into, change into, to grow into, whatever way you want to say it, sublimate into, what's the next one? A guildmaster journeyman. This is like the modern period, is 1600s to 1800s-ish, whatever. Guildmaster, owners, journeyman's the worker, right? Then that stage, because same economic necessity, so forth, will transform into here's the last stage of history of classes. And the last stage, he says it a couple different ways. It's either capitalist, proletariat. More often than not, you hear bourgeoisie, proletariat, or bourgeois, proletariat. The middle class, but that he means there by the owning class and the workers, right? And where the slave and master were like this in lives, if in their daily life, but like this, different in their kind of life, now in capitalism, the difference is even further. My arms aren't even long enough. And one doesn't even know the other. I mean, not only is it a different kind of life, but one doesn't even see the other. Or not often enough. It's not like a side-by-side life. It's completely different worlds, completely different lives, completely different freedoms. This is whipped into a frenzy, this difference. And the owner and the worker and the rich and the poor and that stand in this tension, this class tension. And what Marx says is the proletariat, the workers, will become aware of themselves as a group exploited by the workers. They will rise up and there'll be a revolution. This is what he thinks is going to happen, like by a strict necessity of the scientific law of the ownership of the means of production, right? This revolution, what's it going to accomplish? Well, it's supposed to seize from the owners the means of production, right? So how this works, I mean, there's a lot written about this. There's a lot said about it. It's not exactly clear. Marx, it might be the problem for the unclarity. There might be a reason in Marx for some of that, too. We'll talk about that. After the revolution, though, there will be this, sometimes he says it like this, the popular understanding. There'll be the state. Now, what's the state? Well, it's the people, the proletariat, the people that have risen up and seized for themselves the ownership of the means of production. So the state is the people, but not the people. I don't know how that works. So this is why there's a lot of ink spilled on it, right? So they are like the people's awareness of itself is somehow how it's put. So the state is the people's self-consciousness. And soon that self-consciousness doesn't need to stand over against itself in that objective way. So the state, as this explicit self-consciousness, will dissolve away into like, well, just sort of a self-consciousness. The first moment where there's the state owning the means of production, which is the people self-consciously owning the means of production, that's socialism for Marx. When that state fades away, that's communism. Okay, so there's revolution. Socialism, I gotta say this. Socialism for Marx is something that's Marx only. There's a whole bunch of socialists before Marx. There's some contemporary of Marx, and there's some after Marx. And Marxist socialism is different from theirs. The revolution that would seize ownership of the means of production is Marxist socialism and not other kinds. Okay, so sometimes you hear people say, they're going to come and take my toothbrush or underwear or something like that. Is silliness. Again, usually spoken from not knowing what they're talking about. But the ownership of the means of production would be the thing that is taken by the proletariat in socialism. The socialism of something like Bernie Sanders or some contemporary progressives is nothing like that. The socialism of Bernie Sanders is really something that's already alive and well in America here, as well as around the world, to a greater or lesser extent. It is something like this. Does the community want to tax itself to pay for certain services that this community thinks are important? Right? And if you say yes, then welcome to socialism. Right? Not Marxist socialism, not rising up revolution, seizing the ownership of the means of production, but a sort of directing of the community's resources for the community. That's what that is. So fire department is socialist because we tax ourselves to pay for one. Library, police, department, highways, roads, street lights, all of these things, schools. So the question now is, do we want college to be that way, or do we want healthcare to be that way? Right? So it's not the same as Marx, and so it's important that you keep Marxist socialism and socialism, like in a non-Marxist sense, separate. Because Marx is like is a rare bird there. He's his own socialist. So keep that in mind. Now, communism. What's that going to be like? Marx says precious little, and some people might say, oh, neener, neener, that means he's got a problem with it, whatever, he doesn't know what he's talking about. The real reason is this, is that Marx says this, for real, that our self-understanding comes by way of the ownership of the means of production. The material conditions that carve up the world are how we understand ourselves, right? So the world's carved up according to mine and not mine. Don't go there. No trespassing. Hey, that's mine. Put that down. Don't stand so close to me. You're a jerk. Give me mine. All of that, right? So everything is all carved up according to mine, not mine. Ownership of the means of production. When that goes away, how will we understand ourselves? This is why Marx is silent. Not because he doesn't know what to say or anything. Well, maybe he doesn't know what to say, but because he can't know what to say. That world will have a new self-understanding. The world that is not determined by the ownership of the means of production will be a clean and beautiful new world, or at least completely different from this one, right?